I saw this job posting, and it was, this was pre-internet, so I don't know where I saw it, but anyway, a job listing at Symantec. And I applied for the job, and it was so funny because I met the hiring manager who was the head of technical writing for that division of Symantec. And she said to me, I conjured you up. And I said, what are you talking about? And she said, I was talking to my staff members, and I said, we need to hire a writer who did something like write the Photoshop tutorial. And then you applied for the job. So they were like, they wanted someone who had my background. Yeah, it was this incredible kismet. So I got the job, and I worked there that was the longest I had stayed anywhere. I stayed there for like 4.5 years.
In a corporate world where all employees have great leaders with no egos that create fun cultures where people can do their best work, the employees and companies thrive while doing great things for the customers, themselves, and each other.
Well, we know that rarely happens. I'm Jeff Palacio. I have been a leader for over 40 years for every t-shirt size company, from small 16 employees to extra large over 1 million. Please join me while I interview outstanding leaders that will share stories of great leadership and not so great. It will help you become a better leader while poking fun at all the crazy shit that happens in corporate America.
Hi. I'm Joe Deshawn, and welcome to the Corporate Couch with Jeff Palacio. Today's episode is brought to you by Palacio and Partners, providing turnkey podcast creation, hosting, production, promotion, and related creative resources for you and your business. Today, Jeff is interviewing Minette Norman. Minette is an author, speaker, and leadership consultant who previously spent decades leading global technical teams in the software industry. Her most recent position was Vice President of Engineering Practice at Autodesk. Minette is a keynote speaker on inclusive leadership, psychological safety, collaborative teams, and empathy. She was named in 2017 as one of the most influential women in Bay Area business by the San Francisco Business Times and as the Business Role Model of the Year in the 2018 Women in IT Silicon Valley Awards. Minette is the author of The Boldly Inclusive Leader and the co-author of the Psychological Safety Playbook. Let's listen as Jeff talks to Minette.
Minette, welcome to the Corporate Couch today.
Thank you, Jeff. I'm very happy to be here with you.
Very excited to talk to you. Very excited. We're in the same age bracket, actually the same birth year, so that's cool. And just you have a fantastic background. I love people's career journeys, and we'll talk about your college experience, but you're our second graduate of Tufts University. Seth Godin was the first one to appear on the Corporate Couch. So
I'm in good company.
Yeah.
I'm in such good company with Seth Godin, and I heard your interview with Seth, which was amazing.
Yeah, thank you for listening. It was funny. I didn't get nervous because I've been following him since the mid '90s, and I haven't read all 23 of his books or all 10,000 of his blogs, but I've read a lot of them. I'm pretty routine in terms of reading his daily 7 days a week blog posts. But as I got going through the interview, it was interesting because here I knew like so much about him. His wife's name, where he lives, his 2 children, went to Tufts, same birth year as us, right? Yep. Know when his birthday is. And then as we got going, it was like, oh God, I know so much about him. This is the first time I'm talking to him, so that was kind of weird. And then the second thing, if you remember Dennis Miller, the comedian, his jokes were so sometimes complex that like 3 minutes later, you're laughing at him, and I felt the same way with Seth. Some of his ideas, like even his short blog posts, sometimes I have to reread them 3 or 4 times and I still don't get it. So, he would make a point during the episode and I'd be like, oh yeah, I get it now 3 minutes later. So it's all good. But but it's not about Seth Godin. Love you, Seth. But today's Minette's turn. So, So Minette, I'd love to start with a kind of a question that kind of a little off the cuff, but even people that know you fairly well, whether they're, acquaintances or people that follow you on various social media, what one thing would surprise them about you?
Well, this one is pretty obscure. I think very few people know this about me. And that is that when I was 23, 24, I ended up teaching sex education in a private school in New York City.
Wow. That, there you go.
That's an obscure one, right?
That's a good one. Yeah. I've had, let's see, one guest was a surrogate mother twice. One was twins too. So twins, and then one single. And then one was a burlesque dancer.
Okay, so now you've got a sex education.
Yeah, sex education. That was great. Oh, wow. That is phenomenal. And what was the best question you ever got that you could not answer?
When I was a sex ed teacher?
Yeah.
Ms. Norman, how many times a week do you have sex? And I said, that is off limits. No personal. It was a room full of seventh grade boys. I was teaching at a private school in New York. I was actually a French teacher, but I was the junior teacher. I had just come out of Tufts. And so they gave me French, I think history.
PE.
So I was PE. I had to do PE with the boys. Yes, exactly. And sex ed. So yeah, I told them they could ask me anything, but nothing personal. And they tested me on that one.
Wow. God, I'd be just shocked to even go there at seventh grade. That's amazing.
They were New York City rich kids mostly.
Yeah.
And they were fearless. I actually had a seventh grader ask me out on a date. So yeah.
Wow.
It was a wild time.
Now, I did have a crush on my seventh grade history and English teacher, Mrs. Jansen and Mrs. Arnold. So if you're listening, I've revealed that for the first time publicly. But yeah, I would never ask him on a date. Trust me. I was petrified till I didn't ask till my senior year in high school anyone for a date. So
let alone your teacher, right?
Yeah. Minette, based on our first conversation after we were introduced by Sydney McGovern, you grew up in New Jersey, correct?
No, I was born in New Jersey, but we moved to Oakland, California when I was like 2.5. So I really don't remember New Jersey. I grew up in Oakland and spent my childhood there.
What exit was it where you were born in New Jersey? Because that's
I don't know, but it was Long Branch, New Jersey, near Asbury Park.
Oh yeah. Since you were only 2 when you left.
I wasn't looking at the freeway exits.
Yeah, no,
right?
because that's the standard, greeting or not greeting, but what exit are you from in Jersey? What was fun for you growing up? What did you love doing?
I was a big reader. I remember just spending summers getting books out of the library and reading. I had really good friends. I've just been like my whole life, and it's so amazing. I'm still good friends with friends I met in kindergarten and first grade. Wow. And played a lot of games. And, we lived in this neighborhood in Oakland, which was up in the hills, and there were trails near us. And it was the time when your parents just let you out and said, come home for dinner. So we were kind of wild children.
Right.
We were out doing all sorts of things that now would be, completely forbidden. And we had a lot of freedom as kids. So I loved that, just like go out and play and come home for dinner. And there were a lot of kids in the neighborhood. So we were out on our bikes and on the trails, and yeah.
Yeah, it was definitely a different time. I remember one time, and I was in college, their summer break, and my mom was at my aunt's house across town, and my friend called up, hey, there's a party in Long Island. I lived in Peekskill, New York, so it was about a 2-hour drive. So I literally left my mom a note, hey, I'm going to Long Island. I'll be back Sunday. No cell phone. It's just,
and they didn't worry.
They didn't even know where I was.
Yeah, that's how it was. Like, as long as we showed up for dinner, no questions asked about what we've been up to. So it was a pretty free childhood, which was great.
Yeah. Any aspirations when you're like 10 years old? Hey, when I grow up, I'm going to be this. What was that for you?
It varied. So when I was 10, I wanted to be a veterinarian. That was an early aspiration. I always wanted to be a writer. That was somewhere in there all the time. And then once I got to high school, I got into acting, and I really wanted to be a professional actor. And in fact, that's what I studied at Tufts. I studied drama and French. And I very much, for probably from about ninth grade until I graduated and after Tufts, I wanted to be a professional actor. That was my main aspiration.
Yeah. Did you love movies growing up or plays? What was your kind of
Both. Yeah, my parents were really into the theater, so we went to a lot of plays, and I loved stage acting, but then I was also into movies. So both, and anything would have been fine.
Yeah. What was some of your favorite movies growing up?
Now you're testing my memory, but I will tell you one that I remember going to too young. My parents took me to right when it came out, which was The Godfather, which was like, what was that, like 1972 or something like that?
Yeah.
So I was 12.
Yeah.
And at the time, I didn't fully take it all in, but it was memorable, and it became one of my favorite movies as an adult. So I would say that's the most memorable movie of my childhood.
Yeah. Yeah. My brother, older brother, took me to Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid.
Oh, I remember that.
And that was my first, like, I had gone to Batman movies,
all the kids movies. Yeah.
Right. All the kids movies. But that was my first like adult movie. And I'm like, I forget, that came out in 71 or 73.
Yeah, around the same time.
Around the same time as The Godfather. And I remember like, it was Paul Newman, Robert Redford, Catherine Ross. And like the first scene was like Catherine Ross exposing her breasts. And I was just like, oh, wow.
Mind blown, right?
I was like, wow. It's just much better than Batman with Adam West. But, so you go into Tufts. Was it hard to get into the program, the drama program there?
No. So back in the day, Tufts was not nearly as well known as it is now, and in fact, it was in some ways a backup school for me. And I had never even heard of Tufts. I was on the West Coast, and I had a high school teacher, my English teacher, and he was a really great guy. And he said, "You would love Tufts, Minette." And so I applied to it just kind of as a safety school. So now that's not how it is, but then it was much easier to get into. So I got into Tufts and, moved to just outside of Boston, had never having been there before, never having seen it. And you could just declare a major. But what was hard, so I could declare drama, it was hard to get into some of the classes because they were popular, but got in, did my major, did a lot of acting, learned a ton. And I had a double major in French, and I had fantastic French teachers in high school. So I was at a really high level when I got there. So I did that, and I did a year abroad in Paris, Tufts in Paris for a year. And then got out of Tufts with that double major in 1982 with no clue except that I wanted to go to New York and become an actor.
So talk a little bit about your experience in acting, because that's, I think we talked about it when we first were on our initial call. My son was at University of Cincinnati in their Conservatory of Music program there. So it's, all acting, dancing, singing, Pilates, all that good stuff to prepare them. But talk about your journey and how hard it was.
Yeah, I loved what I loved immediately, even in high school, was just like being on that stage. And something that's so wonderful about stage acting is that you never know what's going to happen night to night. Like things change and you have to adapt and you have to be just really paying attention to everything. And I loved having a live audience and just sort of that unknown of what's going to happen tonight. But I'll tell you what I really learned going through a formal drama program in college was that there is so much more than the acting. And we had to study not only acting and theater history, but we had to do technical theater. So we all had to design costumes and lighting and build sets and all of that. And I think one of the things that gave me was such an appreciation for all of the people and all of the skills that go into making a production, and that it's not just these actors on the stage, but everything that's behind the scenes and how complicated that all is. And, years later, of course, when I was in the tech industry and all of that, people have asked me like, well, how did your drama education prepare you? Did it in any way translate into your skills in the business world and the technical world? And I think absolutely yes, because I think it's that appreciation that it takes a village, it takes a whole team to put together the magic that is theater or that is making a product. And so the appreciation for all the different skills and all the different people that are required to put this on and to make this happen. And I think those skills and that appreciation translates into anything you build together.
Yeah. Yeah. My son was in various productions starting probably in about sixth grade, obviously through college and a little bit of post-college. And I definitely witnessed a lot of that with him, the whole tech week and
Yeah.
And then University of Cincinnati was the same thing. They had to participate. If they weren't in a show, they still participated in some aspect.
Yeah.
Was the lighting or whatever, so they can learn all aspects of the craft. So which I think is phenomenal. I know for my son, he eventually pivoted, got his master's in climate change at Columbia University after taking basically maybe 12 hours of what you and I would call, or most college kids would call, regular college courses like, whatever, history or French or whatever. But yeah, I mean, he struggled with the rejection because, this is one thing getting rejected on a job interview, but you're usually not, going on a lot of those. You eventually get a job, but, it's constant rejection. I think the numbers are like, for every 100 auditions, you get 2 gigs. So how did you handle that?
Well, that was exactly what made me pivot, and pretty quickly, actually. So I did go to New York, and in fact, that's where I got that job teaching French and sex ed. But auditions for me and rejection I was just too sensitive, and I realized I cannot live my life like this, being so judged, whether it's how you look or you're not right for the part or whatever. And I'm just like, this is so painful.
Yeah.
And of course, most of the actors that I knew in New York were waiting tables for a living and going to classes and auditions at night. And I'm just like, I don't think this is the life for me. So, I think I learned it pretty early. And then I was like, I was teaching French, and then I taught French for a couple of years living in New York. And then I was sick of that, and I decided to try something else. And I got another job using my French. So my drama education didn't serve me well for getting jobs, but my French, being fluent in French, did. And I got another job in New York City, and I was working for the French Trade Commission. And I spent about 3 years there. And it was really during that time that led me to my pivot to tech, which is that while I was at the French Trade Commission, they introduced PCs. So they had typewriters on the desks, and then they replaced them with IBM PCs. And so suddenly I was dealing with computers, and I was a quick study, and I liked it, and I would learn quickly, and I would help others learn. And that's what led me into my 30-year career in the software industry. I ended up leaving New York in 1988. I decided I wanted to move back to California. And a friend of mine said, "Oh, you should get a job as a technical writer." And so that was my next pivot. I didn't really know what that was, but he explained to me, at the time it was writing manuals for software. And so I was in San Francisco in 1988. I got hired at Adobe in 1989. And it was when they were developing Photoshop 1.0. And that's what got me started. I wrote the tutorial for Photoshop 1.0, which came out in early 1990. And then I spent the next 30 years in the software industry, leaving behind theater. But that French degree and the computers on my desk, that's what led me into that long career that I had.
Yeah, so interesting. I mean, that's in the pioneer territory, Adobe 1.0, Photoshop.
Totally. I have an artifact here in my desk, which I'll share with you because it is such a thing from Silicon Valley.
Yeah.
That was the Photoshop 1.0 tutorial.
Yeah.
They used to have books in the boxes.
Yeah, I still remember getting my first Adobe file, Photoshop, it's a PDF, and it was like, oh wow, this is cool, so interesting. But just to go back into the drama world, because I think it relates to any person coming out of college. It's like I remember my son had a class like, hey, you need to get another job when you don't have a, regular gig. So you got to figure out what that is, as well as, how to set a budget, expenses, yada, yada. So that was great. But not only for drama, people and people in the arts, but I think, colleges should teach a little bit about rejection to everyone that's going to graduate, because interviews are about rejection. Auditions obviously are about rejection, and you need a way to, and I think it's, when you're in the arts, I think it's even harder because you're the person getting rejected.
Yeah. It's very personal.
Yeah. That's your, that's your craft, versus, you may not be a right fit for a job. And I guess, it is somewhat similar because maybe you're not the right fit for the role, but I don't know. It just seems much more, and you go on much more of them because it's constant auditioning, unless you are lucky and get a role on
Yeah.
some major show that's gonna just started or whatever.
Yeah, and I got a taste of that even in school because, we had to audition for all the shows at Tufts and I didn't get into a lot of them. Yeah, it's painful. And I don't know. I don't think you ever really develop a thicker skin necessarily, but if you are a professional actor, that just is part of the job and you get used to it. But I think I didn't stick with it long enough and said, no, this is too hard.
And I want to touch on one other part of your kind of tech writing career and your kind of tech industry before you went to Autodesk. You worked at Symantec in the early days too,
I did.
in the 90s, and that was their go period. How'd you get that job, and what was fun about that culture versus Adobe, or how was it different?
Oh, so it was funny because in between Adobe and Symantec, I had two other jobs. So I stayed at, and it was like the early days of Silicon Valley and everyone was just hopping around. There was so much excitement. So I was at Adobe for a couple of years. And then I went to this company called EFI, which is still around. And then I went to a startup called Chaos Tools that did not make it. And as they were going under, I saw this job posting and it was, this was pre-internet. So I don't know where I saw it, but anyway, a job listing at Symantec. And I applied for the job and it was so funny because I met the hiring manager who was the head of technical writing for that division of Symantec. And she said to me, I conjured you up. And I said, what are you talking about? And she said, I was talking to my staff members and I said, we need to hire a writer who did something like write the Photoshop tutorial. And then you applied for the job. So they were like, they wanted someone who had my background. Yeah, it was this incredible kismet. So I got the job and I worked there that was the longest I had stayed anywhere. I stayed there for like 4.5 years.
Yeah.
And, Symantec was, this was the 90s. This is now the mid 90s. And they were doing really well. And they had all these different divisions. So like people knew about Norton antivirus. They had all of this actually coding software. And then they had this division that I was in, which was called ACT. And I don't know if you remember ACT. It was a contact manager.
Yeah, they called it a CRM.
It was the early CRM. Yeah, exactly.
It was basically an automated Rolodex.
Successful. Exactly. It was super successful at the time. And I used to go out to trade shows. Like I remember going to Comdex, the big Comdex in Vegas, and answering questions about ACT for customers. And it was like salespeople used it. It was a big deal. So that's what I worked on.
Yeah, Goldmine was the big competitor. ACT and
that's
Goldmine.
Right.
Yeah.
That's right. You remember those days. So that was the 90s. That what was going on, that was like the heyday of Silicon Valley and software, like when things were coming up and they would have these incredibly lavish holiday parties. Like it was over the top back then. It was fun. It was really fun to be part of that.
Yeah. Those are pretty, Adobe and Symantec, pretty iconic companies. What you learn about culture and culture building at those two companies in your early days?
Yeah. I think honestly, Adobe, I was so new to it. It was like I was taking everything in. So
I was doing sex education, getting asked out by 7th grade boys.
Exactly. And now I'm writing about Photoshop. So I was just like a sponge. But what I will tell you about Symantec, because this was more memorable because I had already been in the industry for a while and I had been at 3 different companies before there. One of the things that I learned at Symantec has stayed with me the rest of my career. And that was, what does it take to create a high-performing team? And I lucked into this group that I was a part of. We were a cross-functional team. We were working on ACT version 3.0, and we had software development and test and design and product management and all of us together. And everyone contributed equally. It was not like the tech writers, the lower one on the totem pole, or the tester is. It was like everyone is equal and everyone has something to contribute, and we're going to listen to everyone. We had so much fun. So we were just this team that gelled in an amazing way, and we listened to one another and we argued a lot, but we were arguing to create the best product we could, and we were all in it for the right reasons. And that team that I was a part of way back in the mid 90s was something I tried later when I started managing teams, especially, was like, how do I recreate that environment where everyone's fully committed and everyone's doing their best work and we hear from everyone? And I was like, that was amazing. And it had nothing to do with our management because we were all peers. We didn't even have any managers in that room. It had to do with how we interacted with one another. And that's like, that's the magic in many ways.
Yeah. Did you see any, I mean, you were in a tech world, in your late 20s, early 30s, when you first got into it, but, being a woman in that world, did you see any kind of, oh, wow, this is happening, or, things that shocked you?
Are you drowning in boring corporate communications? Palacio and Partners is here to rescue you. We transform internal podcasts from snooze fest to must-listen content that actually connects your team and strengthens your culture. Imagine podcast episodes that make your employees laugh while staying informed. Our founder, Jeff Palacio, doesn't just create podcasts. He creates conversations that break through the noise. Whether you're a growing startup or a massive corporation, we turn your company's story into audio gold. Leadership becomes human. Remote teams feel connected. Your message cuts through the clutter. Palacio and Partners, where corporate communications gets a fun makeover. Let's make your podcast work harder than your email inbox ever could. Jeff is happy to share his insights on podcasting with you. You can contact him via LinkedIn or schedule a Zoom call via the link in the episode description.
Being a woman in that world, did you see any kind of, oh, wow, this is happening, or, things that shocked you?
It was very interesting because I've been asked that question a lot, as you can imagine. And people have said like, oh, it must have been really hard being a woman in those early days. And I would say in the early days, it wasn't so hard, even though engineering was largely male. There were some women engineers, but they were the minority. I did not encounter shocking things directed at me. I heard about things that other women went through that I didn't. Like one of my colleagues not at Adobe, this was at one of the startups I worked at. She told me about like something that shocked me so much that had happened. Her male boss, basically made a pass at her. And I was like, are you going to report this? This is when my eyes were open. She's like, oh my God, no, I have to keep my job.
Yeah.
Right. And so the stuff that women put up with so that they could stay in the workforce, it didn't happen directly to me, but it happened to women that I knew. And that was shocking.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So at this point, were you all individual contributor roles up until this point in your career?
Yes. Yeah. Yes. Until a little bit into Autodesk. And it was funny when I was at Symantec, my manager, I can't remember what happened, but she wanted me to be a manager there. And I was like, no, I'm really enjoying the individual contributor role. I had no aspirations to management. So I kept refusing to become a manager, even though that multiple people were trying to twist my arm. And I was like, nope, I'm enjoying this hands-on work. So I tried to avoid it for a long time. And then ultimately when I did become a manager, I loved it, but I didn't aspire to that.
Right. Yeah, which I don't think is unusual, but I mean, you did kind of start later, first time, manager / leader. So talk about that journey.
Yeah. So that was after, so I left Symantec in 1999, if I've got this timeline right. Yeah. And I went to Autodesk and I was hired again as a senior technical writer, as an individual contributor, but pretty soon after I joined, like I would say within a year or two, my manager said, I really need someone to manage this team of writers, and you're going to be it. You're going to be great. I'll support you in it. And so at this point, I couldn't say no anymore. And I took the role. I was managing maybe 5 or 6 other writers. And I realized, because now I had been an individual contributor, technical writer for 10 years. So I had 10 years of experience, knew what I was doing. Now suddenly I'm managing people doing the same job that I used to do. And I realized, oh my goodness, this is actually really hard. It's very challenging. People are all different. They all need different things. There's no one size fits all. I have a lot to learn here. And like for me, I get bored easily. So learning is always important to me in new roles. So suddenly I realized I have so much to learn as a manager, as a leader of teams. I think I'm in on this. And so I decided that's what I was going to do. And I managed this team of writers for a while, and then I'm like, what's next? Now I've been in tech writing for a long time, and I applied for another job within Autodesk, and this time it was going to be managing a team of engineers in the localization department. So localization was getting all the products into different languages for the international market. So this team of engineers was running this like really technical part of localization, and I applied for that role and interviewed with a million people, and I got it. And there I found myself managing 5 men who were all engineers, and that was a totally different experience. And that just led me into the rest of my increasing levels of leadership. But I'll stop there for a moment in case you want to ask me.
Yeah, I'm just curious in terms of was it different for you because you started a little later to go in kind of into the managerial roles, as well as talk about I mean, I know you're a learner, a lifelong learner, but were there certain mentors, whether that was books or people you admired? How did you kind of get to be learn to be a good leader?
I will tell you, I didn't have mentors. I was watching and observing a lot. And so I had people who I admired and thought, oh yeah, I really like the way he does that and she does that. And I had so many negative role models. Honestly, Jeff, there were so many leaders I would be like, what a jerk. Like, can you believe they just did that?
Yeah.
And so I feel like I learned as much from role model leaders as I did from the reverse of like those leaders who had horrible behavior. I learned a lot of what not to do. And I kept saying like, I want to be the opposite of that.
Right.
And so I feel like I was doing it experientially. I was observing, I was trying things out. I was saying like, that didn't work, this worked. And I certainly don't want to be like that. And, one of the things that I kept seeing over and over and most of the senior leaders were men, and how they had their favorites, like they always had their favorites, their little inner circle, and how they listened to people who were in their inner circle and how they rejected and disregarded other opinions. And I was like, that is exactly the kind of leader I don't want to be. I want to be open to everyone and not play favorites. And so I had to really work on that as a leader, because of course there are people we like more than others, but you don't want to be showing favoritism to people. So that was one of the things. And then I did progress in my roles, bigger and bigger leadership roles. And then I took a bunch of classes. I did a lot of reading and, ultimately really got myself an education, I think. But it was in many ways self-directed because I didn't have a lot of formal mentors.
Yeah. Well, and talk about kind of your last huge role at Autodesk, where you were leading 3,500 engineers, and here you are. You have tech writing experience, obviously, but French and drama major. Leading, and probably those engineers are mostly male, probably at that time.
Yeah. So just to make the bridge between when I was managing tech writers and then a small group of engineers and how I got to lead engineering for Autodesk is, so in between, I took these other roles in localization and I ended up running the localization department, which was pretty substantial and important. And it was during that time that the senior leaders, the executives at Autodesk, got to know me because I was running a big budget. I was making a lot of changes, and I was reporting to the VP of engineering. And then one day, the VP of engineering, who was my boss, said, Minette, I'm stepping down from this role. I'm taking another job in the company. So suddenly I find myself, and now this is like 2014. So I've been in the industry for more than 20 years. I am very technical at this point without having been a coder, but I've been managing technical teams for a long time. And I had been watching, I'd reported to 2 different VPs of engineering, actually 3 maybe. And I saw their limitations and I decided I want to apply for that job because I think I could bring something to that role. So I contacted the SVP and said, maybe I'm not the most obvious person for the role, but I understand the VP of engineering role is open. I would like to apply for it. And so he said, okay, when you're back, I was traveling. He said, when you're back in town, let's get together. We had lunch and, we talked about the role. We talked about the previous people in the role. And and what he was looking for. And what he told me was, he said, Minette, I am not looking for status quo. I am looking for someone who could lead change, because we are moving from desktop computing to cloud computing. We actually really need to rethink how we do everything. And so I want someone who can lead change. And he saw me as someone who had led change before when I was leading localization. But he said to me, but you have a couple strikes against you. He said, one is that you were never an engineer. So I'm not sure if you're going to get credibility with the engineering leadership around the company. And that part two is that this is a boys' club. He actually said that. He said the engineering is a boys' club. Engineering leaders in the company is a boys' club. And I need to see if you can break into the boys' club. And so that was the challenge that he presented to me. And he gave me, instead of like saying, I want you in the role, he gave me a 90-day. I always call this my audition. He called it the acting role. And I always say, it's like, well, that was the biggest audition of my career, right? Because I had to try out for the role for 90 days. And a part of that was meeting with all the engineering leaders in the company. And at the time, they really were all men. And just talking to them, seeing what they thought of me. And then they would, of course, report back to Amar, the SVP. And it was honestly, Jeff, that was a rough 90 days, because it just felt like it went on and on and on. And I had to keep proving myself over and over. But I got the role. And one of the things that I loved the most in that 90 days, like a lot of it was hard, but one person that I spoke to he was a very, very technical guy. And I said to him, there's some concerns that I don't have an engineering background, that, I'm not going to be right for the role. And he said to me, you're thinking about this all wrong, Minette. He said, instead of thinking about what you don't have, you need to be thinking about what you have that none of us have. And he said, you think differently than all of us. And that's exactly what we need.
Yeah.
So that was a really great reframe for me and gave me some confidence when I was in like the second half of the 90 days.
Yeah. Wow. That's spectacular. I did need to ask. So, you start out as a manager, you got 5-6 people under you. You go into, you become the head of the localization team. I think you had like 100 people.
Yeah. And in between, I had a couple of other roles where I had like 20, 25.
So increasing,
increasing numbers.
Yeah. So talk about like, especially going from, 20 to 100 to 100. And when you got the big job, the senior VP job, you have 3,500 global engineers under your leadership. I mean, what was your process? Because, it's different leading a group of 7 versus 25 versus 100 versus 3,500 globally. So talk about that and the challenges and your learnings that you can share.
When I was VP of engineering, I almost had a double challenge in that I had about 1,000 people who reported to me on the org chart. And then that 3,500 is like the full engineering population. And so while 1,000 of them or so reported into me, the other 2,500 I had to influence without actually having them on my org chart. So there were a couple of challenges there. One is that it was very global. We had people all over the world. And so like how to really communicate to all of the people in engineering what we were trying to do, what was important, what we were expecting of people. And then the other was to get this group of engineering leaders around the company, basically across all of the product groups, across all of the divisions, to work together. Honestly, that was my biggest challenge. We had been, like many companies in Silicon Valley, we had grown through acquisition over the years. And so what happened is we were not particularly good as a company at integrating acquired companies. And so we had all of these different teams with all of these different cultures, and they all worked pretty independently. And so when I took over, my goal was to get them to collaborate and to share code instead of reinventing the wheel. We had 5 different pieces of code that all did the same thing. So how can we collaborate? So one of the things that I did was I formed a council of, I forget what we called it, but anyway, of engineering leaders, and we would get together monthly and we would, share what we were doing, and I would share the goals, and we would try to get people to work together. And it took years. I mean, I was in that role for about 5 years. It took a long time, and it was definitely iterative, but it was getting people to just be open to listening to each other and to be like, oh, maybe that's a better solution than our homegrown solution. And maybe we could actually work on something together, instead of just rejecting anyone who was not us, not my team. Yeah. So I think that was the hardest thing. And I did, moving from localization where I really knew everybody to this huge huge community of engineering people around the company. I did a lot of listening tours. Like I went to different offices and I met with people and I held, open sessions for people to ask me things. And I just got to know as many people as I could and what they were working on and what their challenges were and set the direction and little by little. And I would say the other thing is I had a great team that my direct reports who handled a lot of the technical stuff that needed to be done. And so, yeah, I had a great staff. I had, built up a community where we worked together, and I communicated very openly. And I think that was one of my strengths is that, a lot of engineers are not necessarily great communicators. They're much more kind of detail oriented and working on what's in front of them. And what I was able to do was explain why we were doing the things, why we were making the changes, and listening to people's pushback and being able to respond to that.
Yeah. I know from your second book, you kind of got less responsibility and new leadership came in. So you had a new supervisor and you kept getting less responsibility. You felt excluded and marginalized. So you kind of moved down. So talk about your pivot to start your own consulting company and the why behind that.
Yeah. So that was my last. So of those 5 years, in probably my fourth year when I was VP of engineering, in so many ways I felt like I was just at the pinnacle of my career. And what I didn't know was I was going down the other side of it pretty quickly, at least at Autodesk. Got new leadership. He and I really, the person that I reported to, and I did not see eye to eye. And he, as you said, he's just started stripping away my responsibilities till I had almost nothing. And so finally in 2019, and it was pretty much 5 years after I had taken the role, I just agreed that it's time for me to go. And so I left the company, left the industry 30 years after I started at Adobe. So yeah, from 1999 to 2019, left without really having any idea what I was going to do next. But I knew I was not done working. Like there were many people who thought, oh, Minette's going to retire now. And, that's a nice way of putting it when you leave a company. But I was not interested in retiring. I had learned so much and I had so much energy and I have good health and, there's no reason for me to retire. So round about the beginning of 2020, I realized, okay, I know what I want to do. I have seen so much bad leadership over the years, and I have been in leadership roles, and I have learned, back to that, like even referencing that team at Symantec, like what it takes to create a great team environment, how to lead change, and all of these things. I want to help leaders do better. So I want to, I was already doing speaking engagements. I want to do more speaking. I want to do consulting, and I want to help leaders create that inclusive environment where people are not marginalized and where everyone's voice and skills are welcome. And so I decided to start my own business right when we were shutting down, locking down during COVID. And so that was like March 2020. I put together a website, just something rudimentary, told everyone I knew that I was doing that. And they were all like, oh, Minette, I would bring you in, except that our budgets are all frozen because it was COVID and no one knew what was going on, right? But what I'll tell you is that it gave me time to kind of refine what I was going to offer, what I was going to do. And by, I think it was September of 2020 when things started to move a little bit, I got my first consulting engagement. And, since then, I've had now 5 years of my business of speaking and running workshops and working with leadership teams. And then I co-wrote one book and wrote my other book. And until I would say then all through 2024, all through last year, my business was just growing. The books certainly helped. I got lots of engagements. And then now things are very much slowing down because inclusion is one of the things that these anti-DEI movement, at least in the US, and it has effect in other places, is really slowing things down. But that was how I pivoted. I left, wasn't quite sure what I was going to do. And I knew I didn't want to go work for someone else. So I guess that's what made me start my own thing.
Yeah. Well, and I know growing up, you thought about being a writer. So, but what was your process? And you I think both books were published in 2023.
Yes. That was not the
your first book,
plan.
Psychological Safety Playbook. I love it. It's very first of all, Seth Godin is on the cover with they call them testimonials. I call them something.
Yes.
This book is a must read for anyone who cares enough to lead. And he said some other things. and which is phenomenal. Your fellow classmate at Tufts, but there's such different books. I mean, the Psychological Safety Playbook is kind of very. I love it with the pictures and it's actionable. And I also noticed like each chapter is 28 pages. So talk about that process. And then kind of at the same time, you're writing your second book, The Boldly Inclusive Leader. And just talk about the process
Yeah.
there.
So the funny thing was, I never ever planned to write. I'll tell you how I came to write the Psychological Safety Playbook with Caroline Helbig, but that was not in the plans. When I was at Autodesk, I was already outlining The Boldly Inclusive Leader. So that was the book that I wanted to write, that was in my head and in my heart, but couldn't get onto the page. But I had outlined it. And then in 2021, I had already started my business and I knew the work of Amy Edmondson, who's the most famous researcher in psychological safety. I had read her book, The Fearless Organization, back while I was still in tech. And there was a program coming up that she announced on LinkedIn, which was learn to do psychological safety assessments based on Amy Edmondson's research. So I signed up for that class in early 2021. And I thought, what I was looking for was actually what the playbook ended up being. I was looking for practical information for leaders who want to create that culture where everyone can speak up. And I thought that the class would help me with that. And the class was really just about running the assessments. And so I was a little disappointed. But in that class, I met another student, Caroline Helbig, who lives in Bonn, Germany. And she and I just completely hit it off. And she heard me say, I am looking for practical information and I can't find it. It's not in Amy's book. I can't find literature on it. And she sent me this email that we've saved this email now because it's infamous for us. She sent me this email, subject line, crazy idea. And she said, Minette, I heard you say you can't find this practical information about psychological safety. I've been looking for the same thing. She's also a leadership consultant. She said, what if you and I put together our, combined 30 or 50 years of experience between us and wrote something, and we thought it would actually just be something that we would give to our clients, like just a pamphlet or something. And then we were introduced to Page Two, this publishing company, and they were really interested in the book. And we ended up doing this for me, it felt like a detour to write the Psychological Safety Playbook. And Carolyn did all the illustrations. And to your point about like each chapter being the same length, we wanted it to be as short as possible and still useful. We wanted it to have a structure where you could read any of the pieces of it by itself and it would stand alone. So we were very deliberate in how we created the structure. And we had this great designer at Page Two, Peter Cocking, who did, I think, just a beautiful job on the layout, just so that it's so accessible and so bite-sized, which we wanted it to be. And so we wrote that while that was, going through production. So let's see, now I'm looking at timelines. That was in 2021 that we wrote that into. Anyway, as soon as we finished the writing of the playbook, I was ready to crank out my book that I had been like thinking about for 4 or 5 years. And I spent 6 months of the year and I wrote The Boldly Inclusive Leader. And that's why they came out 6 months apart. It wasn't really the best thing to do, is have 2 books in 1 year, but hey, they're out in the world and it's all good.
Well, and they're different, yet, obviously psychological safety is part of your Boldly Inclusive
yes.
Leader book. I know we're talking a lot about Seth Godin, but I have a bromance with him. So during COVID, I took his marketing seminar course. It's a cohort program, about 5 months. But one of the exercises was look at book covers, because the book cover tells a lot about the book and the author. And it was a fascinating exercise. I've even did it. Seth's 23rd book came out in last October. This is Strategy. I look at book covers differently now. But talk about the Boldly Inclusive Leader, because it's interesting. I've looked at it and the marbles on the bottom. But what was the idea and the meaning behind the book cover?
Yeah, there is a story behind that. And the marbles actually is a funny thing. So when Carolyn and I were working on the playbook, the Psychological Safety Playbook, we were thinking about visual imagery around it. We were we were playing with the word play. So as we were brainstorming, what is playful? Because we wanted that book to be playful. One of the visuals I came up with were marbles, because first of all, I think marbles are really beautiful, and they're something we played with as kids. Some kids played with them, but they're. So anyway, we ended up not using that at all when we worked on the visuals with the design team for page 2. So then when I was working on the Boldly Inclusive Leader and I was meeting with the designer, she said, are there any things that you like visually, that represent inclusion for you? And she was, they were talking about things in nature. They had all these alternate covers. And I said, there's something about marbles. Marbles, they seem like they're all unique. And they have depth to them. Like, you don't just see what's on the surface. There's like layers of them. And I'm like, to me, a bag full of marbles is like a group of people. They're all different. They're all beautiful. They all have something in it. So anyway, to me, that was like, just a metaphor for the beauty of humanity in some way. So no one gets that but me, probably. But I also think it's a beautiful cover. I think the book is
it's striking. I love that story, and I know I haven't read the entire book, but having read parts of it, I see you're very open with your own stories in each of the 10 chapters and things like that. But talk about being the only leader in the room that's female, and being the oldest, and I thought an interesting point too you had that I was on the executive team. I was the only one with no children. So talk about all those things and any other stories in terms of in the book.
Yeah. Well, I knew that, and that's one of the things that's so different from the 2 books, is that when I was writing The Boldly Inclusive Leader, that the way this book would be different from there are lots of books on inclusive leadership, and I wanted to tell stories that people would remember and that would resonate. And that's what people always say, is that it's the stories I remember and that stick with me. And so, and one of the things about inclusion, and I've certainly read so many books, is that people often think when there's anything related to diversity, equity, inclusion, we're talking about either race or gender. And the way I want to think about inclusion is that it is inclusive of all human differences. And there's so many ways people feel othered. They feel left out. They feel excluded. And I explained in the book through stories some of the ways that we can feel different, even if we look maybe like everybody else. Like, I'm a white woman, so why would I ever feel excluded, marginalized? Well, you're the only woman in the room. Okay, that's an obvious one. That happened a lot in engineering. But too, as I was in the industry longer and longer, I would often be the oldest person in the room. And that, I would never, this is an interesting thing, is like, I started to go gray when I was in my 30s, and I colored my hair. And when I was in tech, I never felt like I could have gray hair. Right. Because I would just be branded the old woman that no one's going to, and certainly with tech, it's such a youth worshiping industry.
Right.
Like, I can't be that old lady. So I colored my hair. So I felt like, I was the oldest. That was going to make people judge me. And then, I chose not to have kids, so it's not anything I'm sad about. But I remember just being like, everyone's talking about kids, and I was the only one without kids. And it's just another way you are not part of the group. And so I also mentored so many people, not just women, but mostly women, more women than men. But all the ways I saw that people feel like they're just excluded from the group and from opportunities. And, that's what I'm trying to help change.
I worked at Sprint in the go-go days of telecom with AT&T MCI wars, and we had a lot of type A personalities. But I remember, I'm going to call them managers and not leaders, other managers would, not frown about people that didn't have children, but maybe expect them to do more because they, more work, because what else do you have to do? You don't have children, right. Which was, to me, ridiculous. But I would love your take on that, since you experienced it.
Yeah. And I think earlier in my career, I didn't, because when you're younger, it's also not everyone has kids at the same time. And so it's people are at different stages.
Sure.
And I also remember when I was in my late 20s, early 30s, none of us had kids. And then some did and some didn't. And it wasn't such a big deal. But when you get to the point where everyone's in a senior leadership position, they've had their kids, right? And so it's just one of those those things where it's like, is there something wrong with you that you, like,
Right.
Either people feel bad for you, like, oh, you poor thing, or what's wrong with you for choosing not to have kids.
Right.
But I did see I know what you're talking about is like, oh, you don't have kids to go home to, so you can stay late and
Right.
do whatever monitoring thing needs to
Right.
happen. Right.
Yeah.
Where do you have nothing to do. Right.
Right. Not knowing, what's going, you could be, one, you need a life. So
Yeah.
whatever that
And two,
life
you could
is.
be, who knows what, I think that, yeah, the thing that I always say that I learned time and time again, and I have to remind myself is like, we have no idea what people are dealing with. They only share with us what they choose to share.
Right.
Maybe they're taking care of, someone at home who's sick, a parent, a loved one.
Yeah.
And they may not choose to share that with
Yeah.
us. So we don't know what people are going through.
Yeah. Being a leader, I would say one of the number one things is self-awareness. And I know that's kind of chapter 1 in your book, and, commitment
Yes.
to continuous learning. But one of the things I pulled out of that, which I thought was so good, like emotions are data. And you cite Susan David, Harvard
Yeah.
Business Review article, I think from 2016. But talk about that, because I think it was eye-opening for me. Not only that, but just a quick story about, I learned later as a leader that, people are not only listening to what I say, but how I say it and my body language and how I carry myself. So I know I combined 2 questions there, but talk about both of those and the importance of.
Yeah, no, and I'm glad you picked up on that. I think, one of the things that I certainly felt like I learned or was drilled into me through many, many years is that we're not to be emotional at work. Like, it's bad to show emotions at work, and that this expectation somehow that you turn off your emotions when you come to the office or the virtual office or whatever. And, as I was, especially in that VP of engineering role, I was reading everything I possibly could about leadership, but also about human interactions and the brain. And I was reading about neuroscience, and that's where I learned that you can't turn off your emotions. And in fact, emotions are critical for decision making. Like, we cannot make a decision without emotions. And so what I was learning, and I was learning through my own mistakes, is like, when we are not aware of our emotions, they're still there, they're still happening. And often we are reacting in ways that we would later regret because we are not self-aware. And we're not realizing, I am getting super defensive right now or super angry, and I'm lashing out at someone because they pushed one of my hot buttons, and all they were doing was asking a question. If I'm aware of this, is I can actually, slow down, go, Minette, you're getting pretty heated right now. Take a breath, take a pause, and then decide how I want to respond in a more productive way, instead of this instinctive emotional reaction that I'm not going to be happy about. And, I was on the receiving end of people who had emotional outbursts, and it feels terrible, and it feels shaming, and it's embarrassing. And so really being able to be aware that we are emotional beings, we can't turn those off. We can become aware of them, and we can decide how we want to respond instead of having an instinctual response. And I think that's really important for leaders, especially because, as you said, like, people are watching you. And when you're in any kind of a position of leadership or authority, people are watching your every move. They're watching your facial expressions, your body language, not only what you say, but what you don't say and how you respond. And so, what kind of a tone do you want to set? That we have to choose.
Right. I think part of it too is, and I'd love your take on this. I mean, expressing emotion. So if a man cries at work, oh my God, he's sensitive, he's compassionate, blah, blah, blah. But a woman cries, she's weak. Now, I think that's, out there. I don't believe that, but, talk about that, because I know you had this breakdown in a hotel hallway after not a confrontation with a colleague, but a disagreement with a colleague. So talk about those 2 things.
Yes. Oh, that double standard for so many things. So it's like the man is sensitive, the woman is overly emotional, or it can be, the man is assertive, but the woman is aggressive, right? Like those kinds of false equivalences that are prevalent. But yes, I never wanted to be the woman who cried at work because it would be seen as a sign of weakness. And yeah, I tell that story. I think that's the opening story in The Boldly Inclusive Leader about when a colleague that I didn't get along with, and I had a confrontation, and I was being honest with him about the fact that I thought he didn't respect me. And when I said that, I mean, that was just like so heartfelt, and not to be respected was so important. That was just like brutal. And I started to cry when I said that to him, and I was really embarrassed, and he was really uncomfortable. Yeah. And yet I think it was an important moment for us, because I think we suddenly had a moment of human connection there where it's like, okay, this is uncomfortable, but he realized the impact he was having on me by being pretty much a jerk to me. And it was maybe he had to see the emotion and how much it was impacting me, and he didn't realize it.
Yeah, so interesting. And you know what, we talked about this offline, but I mean, the title of the book, The Boldly Inclusive Leader, I look at your book and it's, 10 great chapters of how to be a better leader and bring people together and get different viewpoints and get different ideas from people that are not, we all have affinity bias, and we need to recognize that. But the introverts, I think you quote, if there's 10 people at a meeting, and 8 of them are men, the men are going to, the extroverts dominate any meeting, and then you have to bring out the introverts. And if it's a just a impromptu meeting, a lot of people like to be prepared, and they're not prepared. They're going to be as good as the people that just want to talk. So, so I don't look at, inclusive being in the title as being a bad thing. And maybe just because I just look at people, and being a great leader is about people and caring for people and understanding them. But I mean, talk about with the current, administration and kind of the pushback on DEI with that administration. What are your thoughts? And I mean, do you wish you used a different word? Just talk about that.
I'm glad you asked me, and I have a lot of thoughts. I mean, yeah, in so many ways now, like when I wrote the book, DEI was hot, right? I mean, that was like, it was in the post George Floyd days but I wish in many ways that inclusion were not in the title, because to your point, I really think it's just about being a great leader. And I don't like to be niched into a DEI book, that genre. But what's happened realistically this year is that I've had way fewer bookings, and the bookings that I have had, I've had a couple talks based on the Boldly Inclusive Leader where the organizers of the events, like one was an education conference, and they said, we still want you to give your talk. You don't have to change the contents of the talk, but we have to have we need you to take the word inclusive out of the title, because it's going to be on our website, and our website is indexed, and we take federal funding, and therefore we can't use any of the banned words, and inclusion is one of the banned words. Wow. And the first time I heard that, I was so shocked, like to even, I mean, I knew about the banned word list, but to be told that you can't use the word inclusion. And I had all these reactions like, okay, I'm going to withdraw. I can't give the talk. And I actually posted about it on LinkedIn and got lots of input. Some people said, you must stand firm and you must not, compromise yourself. But most people said, as long as you can still do the work and you can still speak the things you want to speak, change the title. And I ended up changing the title. It happened to me again with another organizer who takes federal funding. I feel like it's tragic. I feel like it is cruel and awful what's happening in that these words like diversity, like if you don't want diversity, what do you want? You want homogeneity. If you don't want inclusion, what do you want? You want exclusion. And if you don't want equity, you want inequity. I mean, just to ask those questions, you don't want these things. Yeah. Aren't they what is fair? That word fair. Shouldn't everyone want fairness and justice and what's right? And I think it's so sad. And it's not to say that all DEI programs were great, because they weren't, but just to have this complete 180, this backlash against anything that is what is quote unquote woke or what is related to DEI, it makes me mad, it pisses me off, and it makes me really sad, honestly.
Yeah, I didn't know any of that. I mean, I knew it was, DEI was, a big pushback by the administration. But I'm curious, what did you change the word to be?
So one of the it was really funny. One of the organizers we did like this whole thing. I actually, what I did was, it was kind of interesting. I don't use AI for my writing, but sometimes I use it as a little brainstorming for titles.
Sure.
So I asked Claude AI to suggest some titles based on, this is what it's about, but you can't use the word inclusive. And so anyway, one of the ones we came up with, I think, human-centered leadership, and
Yeah.
and that organizing group like that. But for the other talk I gave at a big conference, I actually totally changed it. And what I started to look at was, one of the things I talk about is the impact of small actions as a leader, and how you don't even understand the far-reaching consequences of your behavior. And so I retitled it The Ripple Effect, because I really like the imagery around the ripple, and
Right.
also the ripple effect, and also the idea that, the ripple effect is, you can do something small and it may have unintended consequences. And I talk a lot about that for leaders, because you may not even notice that gesture you made is now going to make someone feel so bad or so marginalized. So anyway, that talk became The Ripple Effect.
Yeah. I remember an incident. I was a leader for, over 20 years, and I was at a meeting, and I had worked with somebody I'd known for a long time. I actually hired her to work for me, and I made an offhanded comment at a all team meeting about her that I thought was funny, and she came up to me, and I'm glad she did. Just said, I'm new here. You've been here a while. That wasn't appropriate. And it was something about getting her nails done. It was something like that. She had beautiful nails, but I totally understood. I'm like, oh yeah, I felt so bad, but you just don't realize sometimes, and that you're always learning to,
Always
do better.
learning. Yeah. And, in some ways, the fact that she came and spoke to you is a gift, because
100%.
you learn, even if it feels uncomfortable. And I think the worst is when people don't say anything, but then they hold on to maybe resentment or hurt or whatever. Right. Yeah.
Well, she was German, so she was very direct.
Yeah. Good.
German ancestry, not born in, but Minette, I love helping two groups of people. One's that recent college graduate as they navigate their first job search post-college or post-high school even. What advice do you have for them as they try to get that first job, as well as begin their professional career?
Yeah, well, I know it's tough out there right now. Like, it's a tough market right now. And so I think the advice I would give is use any connections that you have, especially if you're like a recent graduate, your parents' friends, your friends' friends, anyone, because your network is so important to you, because that's often how we get our first job. I got my first job teaching French, in this elite private school, because one of my toughest friends' father was the headmaster at that school. Do not be afraid to use those connections, and don't feel like you're lesser because you're asking for someone to introduce you. You still have to interview. You still have to prove that you can do the job. But be sure to tap into your network and cultivate your network before you need it. Have friends, have connections, have people, you may not realize it, but your parents' friends may be really important to you moving forward, and treat them well and be curious about what they do. I think, honestly, curiosity is one of the biggest things to tap into, whether you're just getting out of high school or college, or you're 65 years old like I am. Staying curious to learn, to get to know people not like you, that's going to serve you well in your career throughout your life. So that's what I would say. Yeah,
no, it's great advice. The second group is, while anybody can be a leader in a company, obviously you were a leader throughout your career when you were an individual contributor, but those that want to take that leadership role and actually be responsible for a group of people, what advice do you have for them as they begin that leadership journey?
It's such a responsibility. So first of all, recognize that you now have the livelihood of the people who report to you in your hands in many ways. And, people experience work through their manager, through their leader. And so be the leader that you want to work for. Be the person who listens, who treats people fairly, who is open to new ideas and doesn't have all the answers. And, I think the first prerequisite, if you think you want to be a manager or a leader, is, do you appreciate people? Or would you rather just be doing coding or say, I don't know what it is, but because you have to like people and you have to be interested in people if you're going to lead them in a responsible way.
Yeah. No, that's great advice. Minette, thank you so much. I'm so grateful that Cindy McGovern introduced us. I watched some of your speeches on your website, your keynotes, and I know you're a fantastic speaker and you do workshops. So you're a gift out there to help the next generation of leaders be the best they can. So thanks for coming on the Corporate Couch today.
Thank you for having me, Jeff. I loved our conversation.
I love talking to Minette. Graduated Tufts University same year as my bromance partner, Seth Godin. Seth wrote a testimonial for her first book, the Psychological Safety Playbook, said this book is a must read for anyone who cares enough to lead. One of the few people out of the 180-ish guests we've had on the Corporate Couch that had her first two books come out in the same calendar
Same time,
year.
that's unusual.
Yeah, and she said, I wouldn't do that again. And actually, the book she had in mind first came out second. So she wrote Psychological Safety Handbook or Playbook first, along with a co-author. And then the same year, The Boldly Inclusive Leader came out. And, then, we're recording here September of 2025. And, there's been guests on our podcast that talk about, kind of the inclusive and diversity are kind of bad words now, and you would companies can lose out on government funding if they kind of play in that space. But the more I think about it, Joe, from that perspective, and Minette was saying similar in terms of using the word inclusive in the title of her book. It's all about leadership, and it's all about building great culture. So it's not having a chief DEI officer. It's not like, it's like, I guess if you have a chief culture officer, that's great, but, is that the chief people officer or, really the CEO, she or he should be the chief culture officer.
Yeah.
Right? It's part of their being the CEO or president.
Just
or
what
whatever.
it is.
But again, her career journey shows that, just like 99.9% of the guests on the Corporate Couch, this is like she's a French major, a drama and French major, couldn't take rejection to be a professional actor, works at the French Trade Commission in New York City, becomes proficient as the typewriters were going, to the wayside, and IBM PCs. She became proficient in that, works at Adobe in her kind of first tech job, and writing tutorials on Adobe Photoshop version 1.0.
Yeah,
you talk about.
Yeah. You remember those 3-inch 3-ring binders that we used to have with every piece of software?
Sure.
And she was the one, huh?
Yeah. She was. And it just a phenomenal tech career, and then and then went on to publish 2 books, keynote speaking. It's just lovely to talk to. I really enjoyed Minette. What was your take on the episode,
Yeah,
Joe?
it was a great interview. One of the things that she mentioned one time, and I can't remember how it came up, she was talking about negative role models and how some bosses had treated her. That one of the things that happened in her career was that she was at a position and they slowly started taking away responsibility from her, canceling projects that she was on or things like that. And she didn't say it like that, but I kind of get the impression it's like they were wanting her out, but they couldn't find an impeachable offense. Now, maybe I'm reading that into it, but that's a very sensitive topic to me personally, because that's personally happened to me at 2 different employment situations where, and I know for a fact now, looking back on it, I can tell management wanted me gone for whatever reason, but couldn't find me in an impeachable offense. And so they just slowly started taking away things from me, and they would cancel this project and they'd assign that project to somebody else instead of me and stuff. And I ended up literally with virtually nothing to do. It's kind of like go out and find your own work. Well, yeah, I kind of want to do that, but I need to have some sort of direction. It wasn't until much later that I realized, oh, is that what they were doing? They were actually wanting to get rid of me. Well, why don't you just get rid of somebody if that's the case, or coach them into a better position or something. I really hope that our Corporate Couch audience is better than that they're not the kind of people that would just slowly let somebody simmer in a job that was no longer appropriate for them and let them figure it out for their own. I hope that our audience would bring that person in and either coach them into a more appropriate job or say, hey, this isn't working out. How about we find something else for you? Because the idea of just being slowly simmered to death in a job is a very miserable place to put a person in. And it takes a long time to recover from that.
And I think it's about great leadership. So it's having a tough conversation. Like, people will make their team members' lives miserable because they're being told, hey, you need to cut back, or so they want them to leave, right? So they're taking away things that bring them joy in the workplace and diminishing what their contribution can be and not using their talents. It's a cowardly way to lead people, and you're not leading people when you're doing that.
No, you're not.
You're not standing up for your employees because maybe your boss doesn't like Joe DeShawn. So, okay, I want to keep my career and, get a paycheck, but I'm going to make Joe's life miserable and hopefully he leaves.
And I've seen almost the exact opposite happen also, where it's kind of like a Peter principle, where people are promoted to their highest level of incompetency. So I want to get rid of this person, but I can't figure out what to do with him. Well, I'm going to give him a promotion and send him to some other department. And let them be the problem. Right. And I'm going to send along rave reviews like, oh, this guy's great. You'll love him. Oh, fine, get out of here.
I could talk about this topic all day long.
I have seen that happen so many times. And boy, that is not the way to treat your employees.
No. Joe, so I gave you a week off vacation. We're here at the week of Labor Day. So what's been going on in your life?
One of the things that I did while I was on vacation is one of my guilty pleasures. But I love watching those real life cop shows like Cops and things like that, where they show, people getting arrested and
why is that?
I don't know. It just sort of is a thing that I've liked. I know that you can learn a lot from those kind of shows. For example, one of the things that you can learn is that if it hurts you more than it hurts them, you're holding the taser backwards.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of The Corporate Couch. If you enjoy the podcast, I would love for you to take 2 minutes out of your day to rate us 5 stars and write a review. Please join me next week to learn from another great leader sharing their professional journey and insights.